Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're tackling something quite different today.
Yeah, definitely a shift in gears for us.
Right. Whether you are a student gearing up for a major philosophy seminar, or maybe a professional trying to sharpen your critical thinking skills, or honestly, just someone listening in traffic who is insanely curious about how the human brain actually processes the things we hold to be true. You are our target audience for this one.
Absolutely.
Our mission today is to unpack a famously dense, intricate historical text. We're looking at excerpts from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, specifically the treatise on the theological virtues. And we're going to focus heavily on questions 1 and 2, which deal entirely with the concept of faith.
It's a profound set of texts. And I think it's helpful to establish right out of the gate that this isn't exclusively an exploration of religion.
Right, even though the language is steeped in medieval theology.
Exactly. What we're actually examining here is human epistemology.
The theory of knowledge.
The philosophical theory of knowledge, yes. The text provides this highly logical, really rigorous breakdown of the cognitive psychology of belief. We're going to explore the limits of natural reason, the necessity of trusting things we cannot physically see, and how our minds construct certainty out of the unseen.
That is the perfect framing. We're going to look past the medieval terminology to discover this breakdown of what we believe, how the brain processes it, and really the social dynamics of who is actually expected to know what in a functioning society.
Which is incredibly relevant to you today, regardless of your background.
So let's start with what the text calls the object of faith. This is in question 1, articles 1 and 2. The text attempts to define what exactly the object of belief is, and it uses 2 analogies to do it, geometry and medicine.
Right, so the text relies on distinguishing between the formal aspect of an object and the material aspect.
Okay, break that down for us.
It's a crucial distinction for understanding how human cognition works according to this framework. Think of any science or discipline. In geometry, the conclusions you reach, so for instance, the calculated area of a triangle, or the specific properties of a sphere, those are the material things you know.
They are the actual data points.
Exactly, the data. But the formal aspect, the mechanism by which you know them, is the mean of demonstration. It is the underlying logical proofs and axioms that make those conclusions possible in the first place.
The medicine analogy might be a bit more intuitive for modern listeners, I think.
Okay.
Because the text states that the medical art considers a massive variety of things, right? The doctor looks at your diet, your exercise routine, maybe the prescriptions you take, or even the surgical procedures you might need. But, and this is the key, the doctor only considers those things in relation to health.
Right.
Health is the formal aspect. Everything else, the diet, the surgery, it's just the material stuff that serves that formal goal. If an exercise doesn't relate to health, the medical art just doesn't care about it.
It's totally irrelevant to the discipline. And applying that to the broader concept of belief, the text argues that the formal aspect of faith is what it calls the first truth.
Which, in this context, is God.
Right. In this theological context, that is God or the divine truth. The faith described here does not assent to anything unless it is revealed by this first truth. That is the solitary lens through which absolutely everything else is viewed.
Okay.
Materially, a person's faith might include a whole host of other things, sacraments, historical events, ethical teachings, or doctrines about the condition of creatures, but it only includes those things insofar as they relate to that first truth.
Just like the doctor only cares about your diet if it relates to your health.
Exactly. Faith only cares about these material facts as they relate to the ultimate truth.
Let me pause you there because that introduces a pretty massive structural limitation to human thought.
Oh, definitely.
Because in Article 2, the text asks if faith is simple or complex, meaning, is the object of faith a single thing, or is it a proposition, like a formulated sentence? And the text makes this observation about how the human intellect actually functions. And it seems to imply our brains are, well, somewhat deficient in grasping this first truth.
It points out a fundamental limitation of human cognition, yeah.
Wow.
The text posits that the first truth itself is perfectly simple. It has no parts, no divisions, no before or after. It just exists in a state of pure simplicity.
But we don't work like that.
We do not. The human intellect does not operate that way. The mode proper to the human intellect is to know truth through synthesis and analysis.
We're trapped.
We are trapped in a cognitive framework where we literally have to break things apart and put them back together to understand them. We inherently rely on complexity to process reality.
So because we can't just absorb a pure, simple reality in one instantaneous glance, We are forced to formulate our belief as complex propositions.
Right.
We have to construct a sentence like, I believe that God is almighty. We are forced to use a subject, a verb, and an object. We use language, which is inherently complex and fragmented, even though the ultimate target of that belief is a single, simple reality. It feels like an admission that human language and thought are essentially just fragmented representations of a unified truth we cannot fully hold in our heads.
That's a great way to put it. And the text resolves that tension by separating the object from the perceiver. If you consider the actual thing being believed, the first truth, it is entirely simple. But if you consider the believer...
The human mind attempting to process it.
Yes. If you consider the human mind, the object of faith becomes complex by way of a proposition. Our minds require that structural complexity to grasp something that is infinite. We build scaffolding around the simple truth just so we can look at it.
Scaffolding, I love that. Which brings us to a rather bold philosophical rule in Article 3. The text asks if faith can be false.
And it definitively argues that faith absolutely cannot be false.
Right. And for a modern listener, that sounds entirely counterintuitive. I mean, we see people believing demonstrably false things every single day. So how does the text justify the claim that faith is immune to falsehood?
It relies entirely on that formal aspect we just discussed. The formal aspect of faith is the first truth. The logic here is architectural. The text states that nothing can come under a power, a habit, or a virtue except by means of its formal aspect.
Give me an example of that.
Well, you cannot perceive color except by means of light.
Okay.
Therefore, nothing can come under the umbrella of faith except as it stands under the first truth. And under the first truth, nothing false can stand.
Wait, stand under is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. For someone listening who isn't a metaphysics professor, you're essentially saying that by its very definition of existence, a falsehood literally cannot exist inside this first truth, right?
Right.
Like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, the structure of the first truth automatically rejects the false.
That is the ontological argument the text is making. The author uses a series of comparisons to really drive this home. Just as non-being cannot stand under being, and evil cannot stand under goodness, the false cannot stand under the first truth.
It's mutually exclusive.
Exactly. Since faith is a virtue that perfects the intellect, and the true is the absolute good of the intellect, faith must exclude falsehood entirely. If a person believes a falsehood, they are not operating in the virtue of faith.
What are they doing then?
They are operating under a cognitive error or a deception. True faith, by this rigid definition, only adheres to the true.
But the text anticipates some pushback on this, right? It brings up a highly specific, practical objection. It points to the Eucharist, the sacrament of the altar, in the Catholic tradition.
Right, the edge case.
The objection asks, what if a believer has faith that they are consuming the true body of Christ, but the bread was not consecrated correctly by the priest? Perhaps the priest fumbled the words or didn't have the right intention. In that scenario, isn't the believer's faith directed at a falsehood? They believe the bread is one thing, but due to human error, it is actually just bread.
And the workaround provided in the text for that edge case is just a masterclass in separating essence from accident.
Walk us through it.
The text clarifies that the faith of the believer is not directed to the specific accidental handling of that exact piece of bread by a specific person at a specific moment in time. The believer's faith is directed at the universal reality of the sacrament, the truth that when rightly consecrated, the reality is present.
Let me see if I can map that onto a secular equivalent for you listening. It sounds like the difference between believing in the institution of law versus trusting a single invalid contract.
Oh, that's good.
Right, like if I sign a contract that turns out to be void because of a clerical error, my foundational belief in the concept of a binding contract hasn't been proven false. My belief was in the principle of the law, not the clerical error of the person who drafted the paperwork.
That is a highly effective parallel. The accidental mishandling by a human agent does not make the underlying universal object of the person's faith false. Their faith is anchored in the principle, the first truth, not the logistical failures of the physical world. The structural integrity of their belief remains intact even if the material instance is flawed.
So if faith is structurally immune to falsehood, as the text argues, how does that square with actual physical reality? How does faith interact with things we can see and touch?
That leads right into question 1, Articles 4 and 5.
The blind spot.
Yes. The text tackles the relationship between faith, science, and physical sight. Can faith be something you can see or scientifically prove?
And the text argues that it cannot.
It cannot. It quotes a famous theological line, "Faith is the evidence of things that appear not." But the reasoning behind that conclusion plunges deep into cognitive psychology. The text breaks down the psychology of assent.
Assent, meaning agreement.
Assent is the mechanism by which the intellect actually agrees to a truth. And it outlines two entirely different pathways for the human brain to arrive at that agreement.
Okay, let's walk through those two pathways. What is the first way our brains agree to something?
The first pathway is when the intellect is moved to assent by the object itself. You look at something and its reality is self-evident.
Like looking at a tree.
Right, or basic first principles. When you understand the concept of a whole and the concept of a part, you instantly assent to the truth that the whole is greater than the part.
You don't have to debate it.
Exactly. You also see this pathway in scientific conclusions. When you follow a demonstrated mathematical proof to its end, the object compels your mind to agree. You do not really have a choice in the matter. The overwhelming weight of the evidence forces your intellect to yield.
I'm assuming faith does not operate on that forced pathway.
It does not. In the second pathway, the intellect is not sufficiently moved by the proper object. The evidence is not forcing your brain to yield. Instead, the intellect assents through an act of choice. The will voluntarily turns to one side rather than the other.
The will.
Yes. Now, if this choice is accompanied by doubt or a lingering fear that the opposite side might actually be true, the text categorizes that simply as an opinion.
Okay, so opinion has fear.
But if the will chooses a side with absolute certainty and absolutely no fear of the alternative, that is what the text defines as faith. Faith is an act of the intellect that is determined by the will, not by visual or scientific proof.
To illustrate this, the text uses the paradox of doubting Thomas from the Christian narrative. Thomas refuses to believe in the resurrection until he sees Jesus. He finally sees the resurrected Christ and says, "My Lord and my God." The objection raised in the text is that Jesus then told him, "Because thou hast seen me, Thomas, thou hast believed." So the text asks, doesn't that statement prove that faith can be of things that are seen?
And the text responds by dissecting what Thomas actually saw versus what he believed. Thomas saw one thing but believed another. He saw the physical man with his physical eyes. The reality of the human body standing in front of him forced his intellect to assent.
That's the first pathway.
Exactly. But by faith, he believed in the Godhead, which he could not physically see. He used the visible evidence of the resurrected body as a sort of stepping stone, but the actual object of his faith, the divine truth, the first truth, remained entirely unseen.
The physical sight merely acted as a catalyst for the will to make its choice regarding the unseen.
Precisely.
Which opens up a fascinating speculative question. Can a person have faith and scientific knowledge about the exact same thing at the exact same time? If a modern listener is, say, a theoretical physicist who is also deeply religious, do those two frameworks overlap on the exact same points in their brain?
The text is absolute in its position on this. They are mutually exclusive in the exact same mind at the exact same time. You cannot simultaneously know something by scientific demonstration and believe it by faith.
Why not?
Because the mechanics of the two pathways contradict each other. Science requires the object to be seen, proven, and to force the intellect to assent. Faith requires the object to be unseen, unproven by physical demonstration, and chosen freely by the will.
They cancel each other out.
You cannot be forced to assent by undeniable evidence and simultaneously choose to assent by your will without seeing it. The presence of scientific proof annihilates the possibility of faith regarding that specific point.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. We know that different people process the world differently. Does the text allow for the possibility that a concept might be science for one person, but faith for someone else?
It absolutely does, and that nuance is vital to the entire framework. The text points out that angels, according to this theology, possess the direct vision of what humans merely believe. Angels see the reality of the divine. For them, it is a known, proven reality. It is an object of their version of science.
But for us?
But for humans, who the text refers to as wayfarers still on the journey, that same reality must be believed through faith.
Does that dynamic exist between humans as well?
Yes. The text explicitly notes that even among humans, one person might know a truth, like the philosophical existence of a first mover or creator, through rigorous, lifelong philosophical and scientific demonstration.
So they did the math.
Right. For that philosopher, the existence of a creator is an object of science. They have mapped the logic and are forced to assent. But for someone else, perhaps a person who hasn't spent decades studying metaphysics, they accept that exact same truth through faith.
So the objective reality hasn't changed.
No, the objective reality is the same, but the cognitive pathway used to reach it differs based on the individual's capacity and circumstance.
That perfectly sets up question 2, Articles 3 and 4, which deals with the profound pragmatism of faith. We are moving from the mechanics of belief to the absolute necessity of it. If human reason is the crowning achievement of our species, why do we need to believe things that are entirely above our reason?
The text answers this by drawing on an analogy from medieval natural philosophy, essentially the physics of the era. It examines how different natures in the cosmos interact with one another.
The water analogy.
Yes. It observes that water, by its own proper movement, naturally moves downward toward the center of the Earth. That is its built-in nature. But the moon possesses a higher power, and the gravitational pull of the moon moves the water in a way it would never move on its own, creating the ebb and flow of the tides.
And the text also uses an astronomical observation of the planets to make the same point. It notes that the planets naturally move from west to east. But the first heaven, which was believed to be the highest, outermost sphere of the cosmos, exerts a massive pull that drags all the lower spheres from east to west. Even though the physics are antiquated, the psychological metaphor is incredibly potent.
Because the underlying logic of the metaphor holds up remarkably well. The text is arguing that a lower nature frequently needs a gravitational pull from a higher nature to reach an ultimate perfection it could never achieve in isolation.
We need to be pulled.
The created rational nature of humanity is subordinate to the divine. Therefore, just as the water requires the moon to experience the phenomenon of tides, human rational nature requires a supernatural pull to reach a state of perfection or heavenly happiness that it could never achieve on its own proper movement.
We have a built-in ceiling.
Exactly. We have a ceiling. To break through it, we need a pull from above, and that pull requires us to accept truths that completely transcend our natural, built-in reasoning capacity.
That rationale covers the high-level, invisible mysteries of the universe. But Article 4 asks a much more grounded question, and here's where it gets really interesting for you, the listener, especially if you're busy. Why are we required to use faith for things that philosophy and reason actually can prove?
Right.
If human reason is capable of proving the existence of a creator, why not just make philosophy a mandatory curriculum for the human race? Why introduce faith as a mechanism at all for things we can mathematically or logically deduce?
The text provides 3 highly practical, unflinchingly realistic reasons. It demonstrates a profound understanding of human limitations and sociology. The first reason the text gives is speed.
Speed.
The science required to philosophically prove the existence of a first mover is considered the absolute last of all sciences to be learned. It requires a mastery of logic, physics, ethics, and a host of other disciplines before you can even begin the metaphysical equations.
It's the capstone.
It's the capstone. If humanity relied solely on reason to grasp these foundational truths, it would require a lifetime of unrelenting study. You would not arrive at the knowledge of the first truth until the very end of your life.
So you would spend 80 years doing the math and you would only figure out the answer on your deathbed. That is not a functional way to organize a human life or society. You need the foundational truths at the beginning of the journey, not the end.
Exactly.
The second reason the text gives is even more pragmatic. It deals with accessibility.
Yes. The text explicitly lists 3 types of people who would be completely disenfranchised if society relied exclusively on philosophical reason. First, there are people who suffer from what the text calls a dullness of mind.
They just don't have the aptitude.
They simply do not have the intellectual horsepower or the natural aptitude for advanced metaphysics. Second, there are people who have a vast number of occupations and temporal needs. These are individuals who are entirely consumed by the necessity of surviving, working, and raising families. They do not have the luxury of studying philosophy all day.
Let's contextualize that for today. These are people sitting in gridlock traffic, working 2 jobs, trying to pay a mortgage, and desperately trying to get dinner on the table for their kids. The idea that they should be required to sit down after all of that and read Aristotle to understand the foundational truths of existence is absurd.
It's impossible.
The text recognizes that the sheer exhaustion of daily life precludes deep philosophical inquiry for the vast majority of the population.
Precisely. And the third type of person the text identifies are those who are simply prone to laziness in learning. They might have the intellectual capacity, and they might have the free time, but they lack the rigorous discipline required to do the arduous work of philosophical deduction.
So for all three of these groups, the intellectually limited, the overburdened, and the undisciplined.
The text argues that faith provides a necessary shortcut. It delivers the essential, complex truths under the accessible guise of belief, ensuring that foundational knowledge is available to everyone rather than being hoarded by an elite group of academics with endless free time.
It is a divine shortcut for the busy, the tired, and the lazy.
That's exactly what it is.
And the third reason the text gives is certitude. It points out that human reason is inherently deficient. Philosophers are notoriously prone to making mistakes, and they constantly disagree with one another. If humanity left the discovery of foundational truth entirely up to human investigation, society would be riddled with constant doubt, endless debate, and paralyzing uncertainty. Faith bypasses the messy, error-prone, argumentative human process and provides a stabilizing certainty straight from the source.
It is a remarkably clear-eyed view of how civilization operates. The text acknowledges that a functioning society requires shared foundational truths to cohere, and you simply cannot expect a society to arrive at those shared truths by demanding that every individual citizen independently earn the equivalent of a PhD in philosophy.
The infrastructure of society would collapse.
It would completely collapse.
If we accept that society needs this accessible shortcut of faith, the next logical question is how we organize and transmit that belief. That brings us to question 1, Articles 6, 7, 9, and 10. We're exploring how the unseen is structured into what the text calls the Articles of Faith. And the linguistic root of that word is actually vital to understanding the concept.
Yeah, the text traces the word article back to its Greek root, arthron. In the study of anatomy, arthron refers to the joints of a body.
Like arthritis.
Exactly. It describes the specific places where different, distinct parts fit together perfectly to create a unified functioning limb. In Greek grammar, it refers to the parts of speech that link different concepts together.
So when the text refers to the Articles of Faith, it isn't describing a random grocery list of dogmas. It is describing an anatomy of belief. It is mapping out the distinct, unseen parts of reality that articulate that joint together to form a complete body of truth.
And the methodology for how the text divides these articles is fascinating. It divides them based on the specific difficulty they present to the human mind.
Cognitive friction.
Exactly. Believing that a divine being suffered is one specific type of mental difficulty. Believing that a being rose from the dead is a completely different cognitive hurdle. Because they present entirely different challenges to human understanding, they're categorized as distinct articles or joints.
But believing that the being suffered, died, and was buried
all present the exact same fundamental difficulty regarding mortality, so those concepts are grouped together into a single article. The taxonomy of belief is organized entirely around human cognitive friction.
This structure raises a massive historical question, which is addressed in Article 7. Have these articles of faith increased over time? Did the ancient figures like Abraham or Moses have the exact same faith as someone living in the 13th century when this text was written, or someone living today? Does the body of truth grow?
The text introduces an elegant concept regarding the evolution of doctrine to answer this. It argues that the substance of the articles of faith has never changed.
The core reality.
The core underlying reality has remained entirely static across all of human history. However, the explicit number of articles that are articulated and believed has increased as time goes on.
To explain this, the text uses the analogy of a teacher and a student. If a master teacher completely understands an entire art, let's say they are a master of advanced calculus, they do not walk into a kindergarten classroom on day 1 and dump the entire calculus textbook on the students.
It would be useless.
The students' minds would be entirely incapable of processing it. The master must condescend to the disciples' capacity, feeding them the knowledge little by little, starting with basic addition.
And the text maps that analogy onto human history, comparing the state of humanity in antiquity to intellectual childhood. Mankind was in its developmental infancy, and therefore received the truth in broader, more implicit forms.
So they had the substance, but not the explicit details.
Right. As humanity progressed intellectually and spiritually closer to what the text calls the fullness of time, the revelations became more explicit and detailed. The substance was always present, just as the conceptual foundation for calculus is implicitly present when a child learns that 1 + 1 = 2. But it takes time, development, and maturity to explicitly draw out the distinct, complex articles.
If the doctrine is constantly growing in its explicitness and complexity, it eventually requires a summary. We see this in Article 9, which discusses the creeds or symbols of faith. Why do we need a creed? The text offers a refreshingly blunt answer because the original source material is just too long.
It's a very practical, logistical problem. The holy texts contain the truth of faith, but that truth is wildly diffuse. It is scattered across various modes of expression, historical accounts, dense poetry, cryptic prophecy, and personal letters.
It's not a textbook.
It's not. Furthermore, it can be highly obscure. To extract the exact, precise truth of faith from those massive, varied texts requires long, uninterrupted study and intense practice. And as the text already established, the vast majority of people simply do not have the time or energy for that.
The text explicitly states that the creed is necessary for those, many of whom have no time for study, being busy with other affairs. So the creed acts as an executive summary. It is a carefully curated extraction gathered from the diffuse texts. It is not adding any new information. It is simply synthesizing the existing data into a format that can be easily proposed to everyone, ensuring that no one wanders into error out of sheer ignorance or lack of reading time.
The etymology of the word symbol reinforces this. It comes from a Greek word meaning a collection or a throwing together of maxims. It is the centralized, highly accessible summary of the joints, the articles of the faith.
But anytime you create an executive summary, you run into the problem of authorship. Who gets to write it? Article 10 asks who possesses the right to propose a new symbol or creed of faith, and the text points firmly and exclusively to the sovereign pontiff, the Pope. The reasoning provided is entirely structural. You need a final decision maker to prevent institutional chaos.
The logic is deeply tied to the preservation of institutional unity. The text observes that whenever new errors or new philosophical questions arise, the existing creed often requires a new addition to explicitly clarify the truth against the new error.
You have to update the summary.
Yes. But if any bishop or local leader had the authority to write a new creed, the institution would instantly fracture into competing factions and schisms. The text argues that there must be one unified faith for the entire community. Therefore, the authority to publish a new, more explicit edition of the symbol must belong exclusively to the singular authority empowered to decide matters of faith finally and universally.
It is the exact same logic that dictates the necessity of a Supreme Court in a modern secular democracy.
Yeah.
You need a final judicial authority to issue the ultimate ruling. Otherwise, the society will splinter into a million different, violently competing interpretations of the Constitution. It is fascinating to see how structurally sound the sociological argument is, regardless of the theological wrapping.
It highlights that the mechanics of belief are deeply intertwined with the mechanics of governance and social cohesion. You cannot separate the cognitive reality of the individual from the structural reality of the community.
Speaking of the cognitive reality of the individual, let us pivot to Part 5, the Cognitive Act. We are looking at Question 2, Articles 1 and 2. We have discussed what we believe, how it is organized, and who governs it. Now, we need to examine the exact mental action taking place inside the human brain when a person believes. What is the actual mechanism of faith?
This section is arguably the most philosophically rich portion of the entire text. It defines the act of believing as thinking with assent. To truly understand what that means, we have to unpack the Latin root of the word for thought, which is cogitar.
Let's break that down. Coagitar. It translates to discussing together, to deliberate, to agitate different ideas in the mind. It implies a sense of turbulence.
It implies constant movement. It is an internal inquiry, a weighing of options before the mind arrives at a state of perfection or certainty. To illustrate where faith fits into this, the text maps out a comprehensive spectrum of the human intellect based on how it interacts with truth. Imagine a spectrum ranging from 0% certainty to 100% certainty.
So what does this all mean for you? Let's walk the listener through this spectrum, starting at the absolute bottom. What is the lowest level of intellectual engagement?
At the lowest level, you have doubt. In a state of doubt, the intellect inclines to neither side of a proposition. It is characterized by unformed thought. The mind is paralyzed, completely neutral, and possesses zero firm assent. You are simply suspended in uncertainty.
Moving slightly up the spectrum, we arrive at suspicion.
With suspicion, your intellect begins to incline toward one side, but only based on a very slight motive. It is a hunch, it is a preliminary leaning, but it is not firm in any way.
Then we reach a massive category, which the text calls opinion. We live in a world absolutely saturated with opinions, but the text defines it very specifically.
In this framework, opinion occurs when your intellect inclines to one side, And you make a choice to hold that view, but you are still plagued by a lingering fear that the other side might actually be true.
You're not locked in.
No, you have made an intellectual bet, but it lacks absolute firmness because the evidence you are relying on is not total or overwhelming. The defining characteristic of opinion is the presence of fear regarding the alternative.
And then, jumping to the completely opposite end of the spectrum, we have science or understanding.
This is the highest level of natural cognition. In the state of science, you possess absolute, firm assent. But crucially, you have that assent because of clear sight.
The evidence is undeniable.
The object is self-evident, or it has been mathematically and logically demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt. In this state, there is no unformed thought left. The internal agitation, the cogitator, is completely over because the proof is absolute and undeniable.
So where does faith sit on this spectrum? The text posits that faith is an incredibly unique, almost paradoxical hybrid state. It takes elements from opposite ends of the spectrum and forces them together.
That is the genius of its definition. Faith shares the firm, unshakable assent of science, but it entirely lacks the clear sight or the undeniable proof of science.
Right.
Conversely, faith shares the lack of clear sight found in doubt and opinion, but it entirely lacks their hesitation and fear of being wrong. It is unformed thought, meaning you cannot see the proof, combined with absolute, unyielding, firm assent.
But how does the human brain achieve firm assent without the proof required to trigger it? If the intellect isn't forced to agree by the evidence, what closes the gap?
The gap is closed entirely by the will. The intellect is determined to that one specific object by an act of agency. You choose to lock it in. The will steps in and forces the intellect to yield, even in the absence of the mathematical proof.
You essentially weaponize your willpower to achieve the certainty of science without the data of science. That is an intense cognitive action. And the text gets into the actual grammar of this action in Article 2. It makes a razor-sharp distinction between three phrases: believing God, believing in a God, and believing in God.
It sounds like splitting theological hairs, but it is vital for understanding the mechanics of what the will is actually doing. Believing God refers to the formal truth. It is the medium, the first truth that we trust as the source.
Okay.
Believing in a God is the material object. These are the actual facts, propositions, or dogmas we hold to be true in our minds. But believing in God is the action of the will moving toward an ultimate end. It is the forward momentum of the soul seeking its highest good.
So faith is not merely static data retention. It is not just memorizing the creed and holding it in your head.
Not at all. Faith in this framework is a dynamic movement. It is the will constantly driving the intellect forward toward a truth it cannot fully comprehend, but which it desperately desires as its ultimate good.
That dynamic movement of the will brings us perfectly to our final section, the social network of belief. We are looking at question 2, Articles 5, 6, and 7. This is where the text asks a deeply sociological question. Is everyone held to the exact same standard of explicit belief? Does the system demand the same cognitive heavy lifting from every single person? And the text provides one of the most surprising and memorable metaphors of the entire work to answer this.
It really is a striking image. The text quotes the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 14, which reads, "The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them." And the author uses an interpretation of this verse from Pope Gregory the Great to explain the social distribution of knowledge within a community.
The oxen and the asses. Let us break this down because it perfectly encapsulates how modern society operates. Who are the oxen in this framework?
The oxen are the learned. They are the teachers, the scholars, the leaders, the people of higher intellectual degree whose specific job it is to study, analyze, and instruct.
They're doing the work.
Because of their position, their education, and their capacity, they are bound to have explicit faith. They are required to deeply understand, articulate, and explicitly believe all the complex, nuanced mysteries of the faith. They are the ones doing the grueling, intellectual, heavy lifting. They are plowing the field.
And then there are the asses feeding beside them. Now, we should clarify that this is not meant as a pejorative insult, even though it sounds humorous to our modern ears. The asses represent the simple folk. These are the people we discussed earlier, the ones who are burdened with temporal affairs, the ones who are too busy surviving to study philosophy.
Exactly. The text argues that these simple folks are only bound to have implicit faith. They are not required to understand every complex theological nuance or parse the exact grammar of every dogma. Their primary duty within the mechanics of belief is simply to stay by the learned.
Just stay close to the oxen.
Their faith is implied in their adherence to the teaching of the oxen. As long as they do not actively reject the truth, their implicit trust in the learned satisfies the requirement of faith.
Let's apply this to a modern secular scenario, because this is exactly how we navigate the world today. If you are driving over a massive suspension bridge, you likely do not have the engineering background to calculate the tensile strength of the steel cables or the aerodynamic stability of the structure. You are not an ox in the field of civil engineering.
Right, you're just driving.
You're simply an ass driving your car, trying to get to work. You have an implicit faith in the engineers, the oxen who designed the bridge. You are outsourcing your cognitive heavy lifting to the experts, and your faith is demonstrated by the fact that you willingly drive your car onto the bridge.
That is a perfect analogy. We outsource our cognitive responsibilities in almost every facet of our lives. We do it with medicine when we trust doctors. We do it with economics when we trust financial systems. The text is arguing that spiritual and philosophical truth function on that exact same social infrastructure. It is a distributed network of explicit and implicit knowledge.
But that immediately raises a terrifying question, one that the text actually anticipates. What happens if the oxen are wrong? What if the learned experts, the engineers, the doctors, or the theologians, stray from the truth, make a miscalculation, and lead the simple folks astray?
The text is remarkably merciful and nuanced in its handling of this. It argues that simple people should not even be put to the test on subtle, highly complex questions. And if a simple person is corrupted by a heretic, meaning an expert who is fundamentally wrong, as long as the simple person is free from obstinacy and their error is purely due to their simplicity and trust in the system, it is no fault of theirs.
They aren't blamed.
They are not held culpable for trusting the wrong expert, provided they do not stubbornly dig in their heels and actively fight against the universal truth once it is clearly presented to them by a legitimate authority.
They are essentially held harmless for the malpractice of the experts. But the text does institute one ultimate requirement, a baseline that everyone, whether they are a learned ox or a simple ass, must explicitly hold. According to Article 7, after the time of grace, everyone is bound to believe explicitly in the mystery of Christ.
The reasoning for that is structural. The text argues that this specific mystery is the direct, explicit pathway to beatitude or ultimate salvation. Whether it was believed as a future promise by the ancient prophets or as a historical reality by those who came later, that specific truth is the one non-negotiable piece of explicit knowledge required for the journey. The baseline of explicit truth is the path to salvation itself. Everything else, all the intricate theological math, can be managed through the social network of implicit faith, trusting those whose duty it is to know more.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, navigating an incredibly dense architecture of human thought. Let's do a quick recap of the journey we've taken through the mechanics of belief. We started by looking at the geometry of faith, understanding that the first truth acts as the formal lens through which we view everything else, and that our human minds are forced to use complex language to grasp a simple reality.
We examined the absolute pragmatism of faith, how it functions as a necessary, stabilizing shortcut for a humanity that is too busy, too exhausted, or too prone to error to philosophically prove every foundational truth from scratch. We saw how belief is structured into articulating joints, growing in explicitness over time, and centralized into creeds by a final authority to prevent institutional chaos.
We explored the cognitive spectrum, realizing that faith requires us to weaponize our will, combining the lack of proof found in doubt with the absolute certainty found in science. And finally, we looked at the oxen and the asses, the realization that human society operates on a distributed network of explicit and implicit knowledge, and that most of us are simply relying on the experts to plow the fields.
It is a breathtakingly comprehensive map of human cognition, sociology, and epistemology.
It truly is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you navigate the rest of your day. This medieval text essentially argues that humanity is cognitively and socially designed to require faith. We literally do not have the time, the energy, or the raw brain power to scientifically prove every single truth we need to live a good, functioning life. We are, by our very nature, forced to rely on the oxen.
We have to trust the experts.
Exactly. So in today's world of endless information, algorithmic echo chambers, and fiercely competing experts screaming for your attention, who are the oxen you are choosing to graze beside? And more importantly, if faith is an act of the will, are you consciously using your will to assent to them, or are you just blindly wandering the field, letting the algorithm pull you along? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep asking questions, keep thinking with assent, and keep diving deep.